Alright. It's that dang YouTube playing in the background. I had to end the stream, but now I'm back. So what I just said, if you're just tuning in, is that I was trying to make up excuses to go get something to eat at CVS, the only place open right now. I was gonna get some walnuts and eat that with my hot chocolate, but I said let me go on stream and finish day one of this fast because if I could power through now, tomorrow will be another day. So I just turned the water on right there. And now I'm going to put on a video. Should be in my likes. Should be in my likes. If not, I'm pretty sure I know what to look for. I guess it's not. Alright, so I'm gonna go, let's see. Gary, no. AIDS, fraud. The greatest medical fraud in history. The pain, profit, and politics of AIDS. Alright, so I'm about halfway through. There's an hour left, so let's listen to the last hour together.
California microbiologist Dr. Kary Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his development of one of the most widely used current techniques in molecular biology today.
This is the same
PCR.
Same test they're using for COVID.
This revolutionary technique allows scientists to take a sample containing a very minute amount of DNA and replicate that DNA sequence until there are many copies. One of the first applications of PCR was to analyze human tissue for the presence of HIV. PCR is commonly used in medical and biological research labs for the detection of virus culture in infectious persons.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions that all...
Whoops.
Trouble. I'm not going to pretend that the trouble isn't there. I won't.
California microbiologist Dr. Kary Mullis
was awarded first thing I do is put everything into sections.
For his development of one of the most widely used current techniques in molecular biology today, the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. This revolutionary technique allows scientists to take a sample containing a very minute amount of DNA and replicate that DNA sequence until there are many copies. One of the first applications of PCR was to analyze human tissue for the presence of HIV. PCR is commonly used in medical and biological research labs for the detection of virus culture in infectious persons.
Shorts.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions that all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convince you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of the... I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH to say, here's the progress we've made. And the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. And that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
It's not just Peter Duisberg or some outsiders who criticize the failure of our war against AIDS. It's the orthodoxy itself. They advertise they have not saved one single life. That means, in conventional scientific logic, there could very well be something profoundly wrong with the basic hypothesis, with the basic approach that we use against AIDS.
It wasn't a plot. It wasn't even greed or anything like that. It was a mistake in certain circumstances that happened, but the failure has been that science failed to correct that error. Subsequently, it's had plenty of opportunity to do that, but the whole kind of bandwagon that got rolling.
This year, an estimated 40,000 individuals in the United States and almost 6 million people worldwide will become infected with HIV.
With all the feeling associated with it, the compassion for AIDS patients, the fear of what was happening as this purported virus was thought to be spreading sexually in the world's populations, that feeling, that emotion, stopped science from following its normal checks and balances and putting right this fundamental mistake.
After 20 years of research, with nothing on the vaccine horizon, pretty inconsistent treatments, and no actual mechanism by which we are to understand this tiny little piece of genetic material causes the complete collapse of the immune system, I think it's high time that we started looking at other alternatives. Not to say that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS, but there probably is something going on, and some of the biggest minds in AIDS science are beginning to suspect this as well. I think public health advice that you give to people in the midst of an epidemic has to be grounded in the science. And the science did indicate, and still does, that AIDS as we understand it is definitely something that sexual activity is one of the big risks for.
T cells are a type of white blood cell called lymphocytes, and they play a central role in the body's ability to fight off all kinds of germs and diseases. Now, based upon the theory that HIV piggybacks onto T cells and renders them useless in fighting off infections, T cell counts became increasingly important as an indicator of how far along the disease had progressed. Starting in 1993, in addition to an HIV antibody test, a T cell count below 200 would now be used to diagnose someone as having AIDS.
According to the CDC's own statistics, 65% of patients who've been diagnosed with AIDS in the calendar year of 1997 were diagnosed solely on the basis of having a positive HIV test and low T cell counts.
Certainly, T4 decrease cannot be considered the hallmark of AIDS because it appears in many patients who never develop AIDS. In fact, all you have to do to have a decreased T4 cell is to go on the beach and lie there for a few hours. And if you measure your T4 cells, more than likely they will be very low.
It's not possible to measure the strength of your immune system using the blood. It makes no sense because only 2% of those white blood cells or lymphocytes said to be responsible for immune functions are in the blood. All the others are in the tissues where they have to do their work.
The health infrastructure throughout a whole country security agenda is protecting lives. Many Americans may not realize
that 25 years of unlimited money being spent on AIDS, and yet there is absolutely nothing serious to show for it.
It's too dangerous for the government to fund basic research, because with government funds comes politics, and politics only permits one view to prevail rather than competing views.
All this money spent, this $1 billion, is not preventing AIDS, not curing AIDS, but making the problem bigger.
Science nowadays, it's no science anymore. It's more about application, power, business, industry.
The whole thing might have been based on bogus science.
Why are we spending so much money today on AIDS research? In fact, more than we spend on either cancer or heart disease. Where has all this money gone? And to what benefit? What are the results? What groups of people have found relief? Certainly not those who need it when they enter into research programs seeking some form of improvement or a cure. Is that the reason so many in the gay community are very vocal and organized, gathering at conventions, at open city areas, demanding a release, a cure after all these years.
They're going down a particular path which is leading them nowhere because they're not solving the problems. And all the time the public are saying, where is the magic cure? We've spent millions in this direction. What's happening?
The money in Africa is riding on a large number of people being diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. All of the organizations in Africa that have money are associated with AIDS.
If someone came along and told them there is no AIDS, all there is the same diseases that Africans have been dying of all along, then all of a sudden millions of dollars of funding would dry up.
In 1988, Dr. Philip Kreinen and his wife trained in tropical medicines before moving to Africa to help AIDS orphans. They were told that this was an epicenter of AIDS in Africa, where more than 50% of people had HIV and AIDS. But upon arrival, they did preliminary testing and found that only 13% of the population tested positive, not 50%. Shortly thereafter, they did more definitive testing and found that the number fell below 5%.
It is the first time in Africa that a village has volunteered as a whole to be tested for a dreadful disease, that everybody has got its results, and that the truth has been 5 times lower than the figures given by the World Health Organization of the AIDS control program.
When a person had tested HIV positive, he would give them support, nutritional support, help with housing, help with drugs for the illnesses that they actually suffered, like it might be TB or intestinal infections. He would give them direct help for what might otherwise have been called AIDS. But he would give them the medicines appropriate to their actual diseases, and he would give them nutritional support. And he found that these people, after a period of support like this, had lower death rates. This is the people who tested positive and who his charity was set up to help.
Because of AIDS, with the diseases which are called AIDS here, which are similar to the symptoms of AIDS, they are less and less since now 2 years.
He ended up by saying, you know, Neville, after 5 years, we've concluded that there's no AIDS and no AIDS orphans. And since that time, he's had a policy that his charity and the regions that it serves have completely renounced the HIV/AIDS story altogether. They just have nothing more to do with it because they think it does such harm.
How can you ask people who believe they're going to die tomorrow, how can you ask them to look into the future, which are the children? They give up. They don't invest. They don't want to come to work in Northern Kagera because they think they're going to die of AIDS or to contract it.
The World Health Organization claims that 10 million HIV-positive Africans are responsible for 300,000 cases of AIDS reported since 1981. Unlike in developed countries, where over 90% of the AIDS cases are promiscuous homosexual males, intravenous drug users, and blood transfusion recipients, African AIDS is supposedly suffered by men and women in equal numbers, who contract it presumably through heterosexual intercourse. The African figures are often cited by the AIDS establishment and safe-sex activists in Europe and the United States to prove that everybody is at equal risk.
Oh boy. This has become a calling. This has become a kind of endeavor fighting AIDS, in which people who believe in what they're doing cannot, in good conscience, hold a contrary thought. It's what psychologists call the mentality of taboo. Holding a critical thought, if you are in the AIDS orthodoxy, is against the rules. It's a taboo because it means, or it suggests to mean, that you are turning your back on the people that you are supposed to be helping. The cure for AIDS in Africa is as near at hand as an alternative hypothesis as to what is making Africans sick in the first place.
Right.
And that is what I strongly recommend people do before giving any more money to these AIDS organizations.
If you ask me, are people sicker today than they were 30 years ago? I would answer you based upon my knowledge of what is taking place in Samoa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, the massive civil wars that have occurred, the starvation, the enormous refugee camps, the malaria and tuberculosis that goes virtually untreated. Yes, there is no doubt in my mind that people are sicker in Africa and living shorter lifespans. When people get an AIDS diagnosis based upon clinical testing, they return to their villages to die. They basically give up all hope. They lose their will to live. They become outcast. They're rejected by their extended family, forced to live in a secluded, segregated little hut where they're given only meager amounts of food and water and prepare themselves for death.
What people don't realize about Africa is that life expectancy there has never been particularly long. To think that the arrival, shall we say, of HIV or AIDS in Africa has suddenly started shortening life expectancy in African countries is really contradicted by the evidence.
The media reports that 1,000 people a day die of AIDS in South Africa. It is a number with no statistical grounding, no evidentiary basis whatsoever. It is simply something repeated in the media. But if one goes and checks that number against the actual official statistics of South Africa, what you will discover is in 2004, in South Africa, country of 46 million people, the total number of deaths that were attributable to HIV diseases was about 13,000. That's about 36 a day.
There has been a lot of death and disease and AIDS in Africa for many centuries. And again, our clinical tools and Western medicine penetrating some of these more remote corners of the world has allowed us to define a phenomenon that may well have been there for a very, very long time.
There was a study in the Journal of Infectious Diseases in 1994, for example, that made it quite clear that when they did these HIV tests on a population in Zaire, where there was widespread tuberculosis and leprosy, that the test results in 70% of the cases were false positive. If the test results are 2 or 3% false positive, a test is basically invalid. It's useless in terms of epidemiology. Usually these tests are conducted at a sexually transmitted disease clinic. Maybe 100 or 200 people are tested, or they're done at an antenatal clinic where pregnant women are also tested. And from those samples, then projections are made about the rate of HIV/AIDS.
The infrastructure, social and medical, is non-existent. Post-colonially, over all these 20 to 30 years now, 40, the services have disappeared. Malaria control, TB control. In areas like the Rakai in Uganda, there is no water that's clean. The pathogenic assault, the toxic assault of filthy water, malaria 11 times before you're 7 years old, diarrhea 7 times before you're 1 year old, makes your immune system very, very at risk and depressed. And if you test people with a severely challenged immune system, it is likely, according to the work of Professor Hessig and Eleni Eliopoulos now in Perth, that you will show antibodies that come up from the stress. And these antibodies are being called specific to HIV and are being called infected by HIV. I don't believe that. I believe they are auto-antibodies that are developed as a result of your body's immune stress.
One of the reasons that HIV is thought to be new in Africa is we have blood samples from the 60s that show no evidence of HIV. But the one question that journalists haven't answered is where that blood came from. And if you look carefully, it did not come from the same risk groups that we are now drawing blood from today and finding lots of HIV. It came from British school children in Uganda in a sort of the colonial time when Dutch and French and Brits were colonizing Africa.
If we're really honest, we would go back and we would do much more retrospective analysis, even go back 100 years, to find embalmed tissue, embalmed organs, and test them for HIV. And I think we'd be very surprised by what we would find. I believe we would find that both HIV and the group of infections known as AIDS are old phenomena found all over the world. Based upon my 25 years of research and massive interviewing, more than 3,000 physicians, scientists, experts, and activists on the subject of AIDS and AIDS-related illnesses, particularly how it was affecting Africans, there appears to be only one startling conclusion. That
You're just tuning in. This is a video on YouTube. It's called The Greatest Medical Fraud in History, The Pain, Profit, and Politics of AIDS. It's probably 20 or 30 years old. It's by Gary Null. And I'm listening to it because AIDS was the first virus that was popularized through the media, and it didn't go through the traditional scientific lanes, to become, verified. So this movie, it's halfway over already, but if you go back to the beginning of my video, about 20 minutes ago, you're gonna see, you can just pick out all the commonalities of the strategy that the media is using now with COVID. It's the same game plan, although it's probably updated and more streamlined, that they did with AIDS.
that I can reasonably come to, and that is, AIDS is not about a virus. No, it is about the untreated underlying diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and waterborne illnesses, including diarrhea and parasitic infections. It is about living in dire poverty and conditions of chronic civil war. It is about suffering the lethal effects of the AIDS diagnosis itself, including the harmful drugs that are prescribed. In clinic after clinic where AIDS individuals are provided, however, with good nutrition and clean water and proper medications for underlying illnesses such as malaria, the vast majority of individuals return to proper health. But when AIDS individuals are severely compromised in their immune systems and are given the most lethal medications ever created, they do get sicker and they die. But their deaths and illnesses are then blamed on the HIV virus instead of the real illnesses underlying their AIDS conditions. More and more experts are agreeing on this view of AIDS. And yet, this view has been suppressed as contrary to the financial interest of the AIDS establishment and its drug manufacturers. Isn't it time that we take a closer, unbiased look at AIDS in Africa and its real causes and real solutions?
If the HIV test is so accurate, why is it that 1/4 of the population of southern Japan has tested positive for the HIV virus, but only 14 have gone on to develop AIDS?
In 1991, that was the first that I heard that a different way of looking at the causes of AIDS had been put forward by Professor Peter Duesberg. I had missed this story. He had published on this in 1987. I didn't know anything about that paper until 1991. And when I first heard that there was a different way of looking at it, I was concerned. It was like a threat to a lot of the reporting that I'd done, and I didn't like to feel that I was going to have to change tack on something that I'd invested so much time and energy and so much reporting from that point of view. So when I was told that there was this different perspective, I was resistant to it. And I hoped that I'd be able to dismiss it. And I had a bit of space in early 1992 where I was able to read in more detail the literature, the challenge that Duesberg and one or two others had made to the conventional view, and to see what had been said in response. And to my surprise, I found that there'd been an enormous amount of abuse with which his arguments had been greeted, either ignored or abusive response, but that actually nobody really grappled with the points that he was making. And that made me feel that perhaps there was something here that was worth putting before the public.
he thought that HIV could not possibly cause AIDS because retroviruses were never known to kill cells. It's only when AIDS came along that all of a sudden they started saying that a retrovirus, HIV, was killing cells.
Professor Kary Mullis is one of the most unique minds in America. He won the Nobel Prize. Well, Dr. Mullis believes, well, I'm not going to tell you what he believes. You can hear for himself. He's a very unusual person. We did this interview late at night at his home on the ocean.
Ooh.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions, that all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convinced you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of those. I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH and say, here's the progress we've made. And the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. Now, that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
This agent just hasn't passed the very first tests for a pathogenic agent. And of course, this was what Peter Duesberg pointed out in his 1987 paper, his first to demonstrate and draw together the evidence that demonstrated very, very clearly that if HIV existed, it could not be found at all easily, even in the bodies of AIDS patients, let alone those who tested HIV positive. He pointed out that with most infectious illnesses, you have billions of virus particles present in small quantities of blood and elsewhere in the body of a person, especially those with active disease. But that even in AIDS, HIV couldn't be isolated directly from the bodies of these patients. What you had to do was take samples from the patients, kickstart them with stimulants for the immune cells, mix them with cells from other people, and eventually you could get something out. But it wasn't isolatable in any conventional sense. And it really should have been basic science that told people that the HIV theory was deeply flawed.
I feel that there's no scientific evidence to prove that HIV is either the primary or any of the causes of AIDS, because no appropriate tests have been done. Now, HIV is a virus that is present in a lot of AIDS patients, but that does not make it the primary cause.
You could predict, and I did predict, that the outbreak of AIDS in Britain and even in New York City, which was one of the original epicenters of AIDS when it started, even there, AIDS would follow a predictable course of increase among men, especially in high-risk groups. It is still mainly 90% a disease of men in high-risk groups.
I think the cause of AIDS is different in different risk groups. For gay men, for example, we have to have one thing very clear. Only a very small group of gay men are affected by AIDS. If you play with the statistics, you come down with less than 3% of the American male homosexual population is affected by HIV, not even AIDS. And that's less than gay men dying every year of heart disease, drug-related issues. But in a certain minority group amongst gay men, and certainly as far as we could trace it down, the early AIDS cases qualified as such, certain behavior could clearly cause the two diseases that were initially the AIDS-defined diseases, PCP and KS.
It's extraordinarily difficult to become infected with HIV. You have to have a very special receptor on your cells. This is only recently, the New York Times put this out last week, that some work was done where they found that you need another protein called fusin so that HIV could actually infect the cell. So the fact is, unless there's something that people can take to make them susceptible to HIV that could mimic this fusion so that HIV can infect cells, the cells are not so easily infected.
Is this the most studied virus ever?
Absolutely. 60,000 papers have been published on it just earlier last year. 60,000. That's 6 papers for every little nucleotide that's in that virus. That is orders of magnitude more than on polio, or measles, or mumps, on all viruses combined.
And yet we still cannot prove that it explodes and is massive to the population.
Or that it causes AIDS, for that matter.
The HIV antibody test is a very bad test. I believe that it is one of the worst frauds committed on the American public in the century. Well, just about everybody believes that if you get one of these tests, it will actually tell you whether or not you are infected with HIV, and if it's positive, that that's some kind of a prediction of whether or not you'll get AIDS. And that is absolutely not true. First of all, a positive result on that test doesn't mean that you're infected with HIV, and there is no way that it can mean that. There's a basic scientific principle that most people are totally ignoring, and right now I'm talking about the scientists and the doctors who are advocating these tests. The people that say these tests are 100% accurate. I would say more that they're 0% accurate.
Oh, shit.
And the reason for that is this test contains what you call antigens. They are proteins from the HIV, the virus. And the principle of it is that the HIV proteins in the test kit are supposed to react with any kind of HIV antibodies that may be present in the person's blood sample. So the HIV antigens would react with the HIV antibodies. And theoretically, only HIV antibodies react with HIV antigens. Now, in reality, what really happens with antigens and antibodies is that they're not exclusive with each other. They're more promiscuous. In other words, antibodies will react with antigens that they don't belong to. In other words, let's say I have tuberculosis, and I have antibodies to the tuberculosis organism in my body, and I go out and take an HIV antibody test. What might happen is that my tuberculosis antibodies will cross-react with the antigens to HIV in the test kit, thereby giving a false positive. And these kind of cross-reactions are very, very common and very, very predictable as far as HIV antibody tests go.
We get a lot of cross-reacting. For instance, if you've recently had a flu jab, you're told not to have an antibody test because you might come up positive. 41% of patients with multiple sclerosis in one study tested positive for HIV. 12% of people with generalized warts. If you live in an area where tuberculosis or leprosy or malaria are endemic, you could come up positive for HIV even though you don't have HIV. So there's so many different variables as to what might give a positive reading. I don't believe that any test has ever yet given absolutely specific HIV antibody results or reactions.
You can test positive because normal body proteins like actin and mycosin react with the test. You can test positive for all sorts of strange reasons, and that will go on your medical records, and your doctor will look very sorrowfully at you and said, "You have just tested positive for the AIDS virus. You are going to die."
Now, it's a deadly thing to tell somebody when they have a head full of 10 years of the imagery of AIDS that they are now HIV positive and in a risk group for developing AIDS, in the risk group for developing AIDS, because HIV positivity is built into the definition of AIDS.
And HIV positive means antibody positive. It doesn't mean that you've got the virus. On the contrary, it means exactly the reverse, and hence you should be protected and not predisposed towards getting the disease.
That's the whole purpose of vaccination, to give you an immune response to the virus in the form of antibodies that would be measured on an antibody test. So it's really ridiculous to say to people that because you test positive on these tests that you're going to get AIDS and you're going to die prematurely. It just doesn't make sense.
The problem with the Western blot, and there are many, is not only that it is susceptible to the same flaws that cause cross reactions on the ELISA, but that it's not reproducible and it's not standardized. It is possible to test positive or negative on the same Western blot done on the same blood specimen, depending on what test kit you use, whether it's from a different manufacturer, what day of the week you go in, what lab you go to, or even what country you live in.
Now, the Western blot is considered the more specific of the two tests because it uses 10 proteins to detect antibodies, whereas the ELISAs conventionally use 2 or 3. Western blot uses 10. You can get a positive Western blot in Africa that would not be considered positive in Australia. You can get a positive by official, this is official guidelines. You can get a positive Western blot in Britain that is far more specific than a positive Western blot for the largest gay men's study, HIV and AIDS, the MAX study in America. In the MAX study in America, on the Western blot, which American viewers will know is essential to HIV positive diagnosis, you required only 1 strong antibody band out of a possible 10 in order to be called positive. In Britain, that is insufficient. So we're in a situation where even on the most specific test, it matters what country you got tested in. So is this absurd?
I have a chart here that will show you that one of the best ways to change from positive to negative is simply to change your residence to a different country. This was published in Continuum magazine from London. It was made up by Val Turner, a scientist in Australia who's done a lot of work on HIV
I don't care about the
antibody
tests. So bullshit.
And he's pointed out that there are different criteria for reading these tests. And each one of these columns show
the difference between my training and this, which comes from Gary Null. Now, Gary Null, he's from New York City, but he's not Life Food certified. So he might even believe that there is such thing as a virus, which Dr. Jubb has taught us that a virus is actually a spore, which is comes from mold, which is what our tissue actually breaks down into as it converts, to the other side, meaning death. So anytime you have illness, or you have less than excellent health, you have the other side coming on strong, and these viral particles, virus proteins, actually comes from the breakdown product of us going to the other side. That's our teaching, that the virus comes from us breaking down. So I'm going to fast forward. I don't believe that there is a virus at all, because what they're testing for are these proteins that are coming from us.
that's what's happening. When people are tested in those regions, it is very easy for a cross reaction to take methods of the viral, and now the old standard mainstream AIDS research says that free virus, which is outside the cell, is not infectious, because when it is outside the cell, the envelope of the virus is very fragile and it usually will fall off. So in order for one cell to infect another with its HIV, the cells have got to butt up against each other. And if the virus is just free and it's out floating around in the bloodstream, it's probably lost its envelope. And the envelope is a crucial part of the infectivity process. Without the envelope, it can't infect because it can't bind on to the little site, the receptor site.
The envelope is the food that you eat.
The general public doesn't understand the idea of a gold standard here. Neither do doctors, physicians. So, I mean, you could just pull the average physician away from his.
This is the inventor of the PCR test, Mullis. Mullis is the inventor of the PCR test, which is what they're using now for the COVID. Okay, so this guy, he's talking about his test, and it was used to diagnose AIDS, but now the same test is being used to diagnose COVID.
If it's convention someplace in Cincinnati or something, and sit down and have dinner with him and talk to him about this kind of a situation and see how much he really knows. Like, does he know what a Western does? Does he know what a Western blot actually does? I mean, how is it different from this ELISA test? Does he understand how an ELISA test is operated? Does he understand anything about the statistics associated with the times when they've been tried? No, he doesn't. And he doesn't give a damn either. What he knows about is that when he has a patient, he charges him a certain amount of money for every treatment that he does, for every little prescription that he writes, and he likes to have a lot of patients.
There you go.
And the county health department also knows that due to the Ryan White Act, for every single person who is diagnosed as having AIDS in the county, $2,500 a year from the federal government.
Wow.
So the county health department is actually pressuring doctors by their little subtle ways. They're not coming over and beating them, but don't miss an AIDS case. You report it to us. If it's a positive test on the HIV, you report it to us because it's $2,500 in our pocket every year.
Wow. Amazing.
I'm suggesting specifically, Professor Stewart, is that if JAMA, Nature, the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, the 5 major medical publications in the world, will not allow dissident views on the cause or treatment of AIDS or any information around it, how then are you going to encourage a dialogue that could challenge the orthodox?
Good question. You've mentioned the big 5. You've mentioned Science, Nature, the New England Journal, the Lancet, and the British Medical Journal. Now, with the possible exception of the Lancet, all of these have refused to publish views which doubt the existing hypothesis about AIDS. And the two main aspects of the hypothesis are that AIDS is caused exclusively and finally by HIV, and secondly, that this is universally infectious and will cause a pandemic by heterosexual transmission in the general population. Those are the two prime tenets of the existing hypothesis, which is held by the consensus. Now, the Lancet has published some stuff, mainly by me, in the form of letters, which cast doubt on those two essential pillars of the hypothesis. They haven't published much else, and the other journals have published nothing at all. They've been asked to do so again and again by myself and others, but they will not publish.
Reporters came, asked these questions, and found them, my views or my hypotheses, very logical and convincing. But they never aired them because they were censored at the highest level, presumably when an executive producer would have called the National Institute of Health, is it all right to show this view, advanced by Disbrook from Berkeley, that AIDS is not infectious. And he probably was told from the by the National Institute of Health, this is impossible, you can't show that because people will stop practicing safe sex or will stop taking the ACT. That will endanger our anti-AIDS prevention programs and treatment programs. So that would be a disaster. Don't show this way, and that's what they do. They follow orders like everybody else.
How much censorship has there been in the gay press concerning looking at all issues and all arguments from all sides, fairly and objectively?
The censorship in the gay press is a tragedy, a disgrace. It's been almost complete. There are people in this city who work quite hard to try and create the space in which a proper discussion can be had.
As I continued to work the issue as a journalist, I gradually became more and more skeptical. At the same time, I was also involved in AIDS activism and could see how the organizations changed over the years. I've been involved in Being Alive San Diego. I've been involved in ACT UP San Diego, and now I'm a co-founder of HEAL, it always seemed to me that this would be an issue that activists who are concerned about finding a solution to AIDS would grab onto. They would be interested, as I attempted to share my growing doubts about the HIV/AIDS model. And instead, I saw people clinging to HIV with an almost religious fervor.
The consensus controls the thinking, the funds, the grants, the publicity, and the policy.
The corruption,
the media
huh?
has just gone along with the government party line, and it's partly their fault and it's partly the government's, because I know that any journalist who dares speak against what the government says is cut off, and the government won't give them the story or the information they need to write. So I blame both the government and the media.
You feel scientists have also allowed themselves to be co-opted because if they challenged, they wouldn't get any funding?
Yes, scientists who speak up against the HIV theory are cut off almost immediately. This happened to Peter Duesberg. He has no funding when he used to be able to get any grant he wanted. And one kind of hears to the back door of various scientists who agree with him, and they come to him in private and say, don't say my name, but I agree with you, and I can never say that because I know I'll lose my grant if I do.
Whoa.
My funding, for example, from the National Institute of Health will not be renewed as of this year.
Oh, Peter Duesberg.
And I may be out of business then. Also, my colleagues have essentially excommunicated me. I'm not invited to meetings, or hardly ever to meetings anymore. Not ever to one on AIDS. I'm not allowed to publish in the same journals anymore as I used to. Even as a member of the National Academy, I cannot publish in the National Academy my views that drugs may be the cause of AIDS. And I have plenty of evidence to support it, to document my claim, which might be very relevant to the health of millions of Americans and people on this planet. Yet I'm censored because I'm essentially considered to be an outcast or an odd man or somebody who has controversial views.
I got banned from Facebook for 3 days for posting a meme
One can
about
only imagine the horror
COVID.
of getting a test result that says that you're now HIV positive. For most, they would equate that with AIDS and a death sentence, but not everyone. For many, the HIV positive test has taken them on a unique journey, a hero's journey, overcoming obstacles, as you will see, with a very unique perspective.
In 1988, I was first diagnosed with the HIV virus, and by 1989, August, I collapsed at work. I'll never forget that day, taken to the hospital, etc., to find out that my immune system was on a downward slide. By 1990, I had a cough that had gotten bad enough that I was coughing up blood, had KS lesion on my thigh, in my mouth, down my throat, hairy leukoplakia, etc. And the doctors were telling me, based upon that, especially from the cough, that I would be dead probably within a year.
In February of 1990, I was diagnosed as being HIV positive in Hackensack, in a clinic in Hackensack. The clinician was very cold about telling me this. I really didn't hear what the implications were. I just thought I was going to die.
The doctor called me, he says, I have bad news. And I says, I thought my lover was infected. And he said, no, you are. So that was kind of a shock.
Okay.
I was always tired. I didn't know what was going on. I have Epstein-Barr virus, and I have hepatitis A, B, and C, and every other thing.
There's so many stages to this, you know. The onset of diagnosis is depression, there's anger, there's hatred, fear. Why me? How could this happen to me? And what happens is, you know, your disease becomes bigger than you are.
I want to go back.
And then you're in trouble because
for cell culture,
and call it HIV.
Cancer, they really didn't get very far, not far at all. And somehow, around 1980-81, when the first cases of AIDS were reported, this came to these groups as at least one way out of the mostly negative results they had obtained for about 10 years before. So the AIDS research, I regard it as an extension of an earlier effort to demonstrate a retrovirus in human cancer.
They were working with the test.
All right, so how they discovered, AIDS was about these retroviruses. So Job's not the only one, but there's other, there's a guy named Simoncini, Dr. Simoncini in Italy. He, I think he got his license taken away because he was dissolving tumors with baking soda. So he was spraying, you might even be able to see it on YouTube. He's spraying tumors with a saline solution. Saline means salt. So the salt in this case is baking soda, which I'm not sure the chemical, but it's something. So anyway, he's spraying the tumor with the baking soda, and you know what? I'm gonna pull that up because I need to see this for myself. If they still have it, Simoncini tumor baking soda. Is cancer a fungus? Dr. Tullio Simoncini, here you go. How much baking soda could you consume? He beat cancer. Here's how he did it. I want to see the, let me type in tumor. No, I did put tumor. Surgery, maybe. Entire 2-hour video. Oh, geez. Cancer is a fungus. Okay. See, a fungus, according to Dr. Jubb, the fungus is a further down the line. Mold is the actual beginning. So the retrovirus is the spore of the mold, which eventually becomes cancer. And that's how they found the retrovirus. While looking for retrovirus cause of cancer, that's how they discovered AIDS. We teach that there's only really two diseases. One is toxicity, which is, junk that's not supposed to be there. And the other one is enervation, which is a low electricity. Low life force. So you have something coming in, which can cause a disease, and you can have the body actually not having enough life force. But when I say something coming in, it's not, a virus. It's a toxin. Mohammed Kilani, okay. Let me see just real quick this video. I feel like it might be on this video.
On March 29, 1978, an outstanding doctor told me it was malignant, my lung cancer was inoperable, I should get my estate in order. I didn't even know what cancer was. My mind was totally blown. At that time, I didn't remember that I'd ever known anybody who had cancer. I did have presence enough of mind to ask him two questions.
Gonna make another hot chocolate.
First, I asked, since I was told my cancer was inoperable, obviously surgery was the only treatment for cancer. Is there anything else I can do? He said, we can give you radiation therapy, but it would only make you sicker. I suggest you go home and get your affairs in order. Well, now I know there are two treatments for cancer, of which I'm eligible for neither. I asked my second question. Is there any place else I can go? To which his answer was magnanimous. He said, Dick, I'd send you any place in the United States, but I can guarantee you, nobody knows any more than we know right here. There is nothing that can be done. With this, he took away all hope. At that time, and that's the only time, that my wife and I completely broke down. We both saw it. And she regained her composure quickly. Eventually, I did. But I lived for 5 days without hope. And I can tell you that any minute of those 5 days was worse than all the treatments I went through. 5 days later, another doctor in another city said, Dick, you're a very sick boy. We're going to make you a lot sicker, but we're going to cure you. We're going to cure you so you can work for cancer. I said, if you do, I will. And he was as good as his word. He made me a lot sicker. But on May 1st, 1980, on a routine visit to him, he said, Dick, I won't be seeing you again professionally. I thought he was changing institutions or something. He says some cancers we watch for 5 years, some for 10, some for 20. In your case, if you have not had a recurrence in 2 years, you have no more chance of getting it than anybody else on the street. And because you had immunotherapy, we believe you have less chance of getting it. As far as we're concerned, you're cured. Well, that day, I didn't even need an airplane to fly home.
All right, not what I thought it was. Oh, here it is. I knew it. Let me turn the light off so you can get a good look. I think this is a lung tumor. Adenocarcinoma. Okay, adeno. I don't know what adeno is. Throat? Adeno's throat, maybe? Nose. Adeno? Is it nose? No. There it is. You're shooting it with the sodium bicarbonate solution. Oof, all the way down there. Yeah, so this is a non-localized condition. Wow. I mean, it's still, you could still see it's kind of, oh, nice. There's still pimples everywhere, but you know, that's why healing really is not a treatment like this. Healing is a change in the behavior that causes the molding of the body. If you if you think of cellulite or marbled meat, it's the same thing as cancer, which is, you know, the same thing as pimples, the same thing is causing all disease, including AIDS and COVID. So we can heal everything with no drugs and no surgery, and that's what I'm certified in under Dr. David Jubb. And that's my mission. To go viral with Master Luki's League of Champions, and then sell, because everything is marketing apparently. The world is under the law of the sea. So everything's got to be done through the marketplace. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's where I'm at right now. Marketing. And then, you know, my brand is healthy reverses cancer. Let's just learn a little bit more about the fraud of AIDS, and then we could extrapolate that to what they're doing with COVID as well.
Cells in the test tube and say, look, we have a high activity of reverse transcription, therefore a virus must be inside, and the virus is the cause of cancer. But the nature of cancer is much different, and when they found reverse transcription everywhere, they gave up the idea that retroviruses would cause cancer, and they were not speaking about it anymore, but wasted billions of dollars into this and developed chemotherapy based on this idea that the multiplication of genetic material, and they were thinking of the viruses, should be blocked. So they developed molecules which were incorporated in a growing chain of newly to build up genetic material, and which would kill the build-up or prevent the build-up of this genetic molecule, and the cell eventually has to die. The idea of retroviruses in cancer is long over, but the chemotherapy still is there because it's sold. They have no idea why, no rational explanation why they are using chemotherapy.
In 1984, Robert Gallo comes along, gives a press conference and says, hey, all of these diseases are caused by a virus. Here's his theory. HIV kills T cells, decimates the T cell population, causing acquired immune deficiency, which opens the gateway to infection with any number of opportunistic infections, 30 at this point. This is what we call the syndrome of AIDS-defining diseases. Problem is, if all these diseases among these populations were caused by a virus, one would think that this constellation of diseases, this syndrome, would spread from the original risk populations into the general population. That's what infectious diseases do. They spread out of the original risk populations. Problem is, through 1992, this simply wasn't the case. After 10 years of this so-called raging AIDS epidemic, over 90% of AIDS patients cumulatively remain within those original risk groups. And of those remaining 10%, you have to consider that those included all homosexuals who didn't care to admit their sexuality to their doctor, all IV drug users who didn't care to admit their drug habits to their doctor, and all infants AIDS patients. So you've got a disease that's really restricted to certain risk populations, and it's not spreading. Hence, it's terribly unlikely that this disease could be caused by a virus.
In science, certain rules must be followed for any agent to be considered a causative factor in disease. The first rule is that an agent that is going to be blamed for a disease should be able to be isolated from each and every case of the disease. That is not true in HIV and AIDS.
In my judgment, and to the best of my reviewing of the current literature on that subject, I've never seen a clear demonstration, of a direct isolation of HIV from patients. I've seen some evidence of virus particles observed occasionally in very complex culture systems. But this, to me, is no evidence for direct isolation from the patients.
It's been isolated by thousands of laboratories throughout the world. It's probably the best studied virus of any viral pathogen in the history of human diseases. So to say that it doesn't exist and it hasn't been isolated is beyond preposterous.
What AIDS researchers call virus isolation,
Fauci,
or HIV isolation in this case, consists of two things. They will get their tissue culture where this HIV is supposed to be growing, and they'll check it for reverse transcriptase, which is an enzyme that was supposed to be specific or only exclusively found in retroviruses. And if they find reverse transcriptase in the tissue culture, they say, aha, we have now isolated HIV. Another thing they'll do is they'll check the tissue culture for a P24 antigen, which is one of the proteins that supposedly belongs to HIV. Both of these things, reverse transcriptase and the P24 protein, are about as nonspecific as you can get. In fact, reverse transcriptase can be found in any number of different places. Normal cells contain reverse transcriptase, and under certain conditions, they will reverse transcribe RNA into DNA. The hepatitis B virus also contains reverse transcriptase. And most importantly of all, the cells of people with leukemia have also been shown to have reverse transcriptase activity. And why this is important is that every HIV culture, starting with Robert Gallo, were co-cultured with leukemia tissue. You couldn't just take the blood from somebody with AIDS and culture it in the tissue culture all by itself, because nothing would grow. They couldn't find any HIV that way. So they had to co-culture it with cancer cells or tissue from people with leukemia.
We know what is reverse transcription.
Oh my God.
That's the repair of mechanism of the ends of the chromosomes. Yeah, and therefore we have high activity in cancers.
That's why this video is called the greatest medical fraud in history. And I would say that the COVID scam is a continuation of that. Just so happens that this guy is in the video as a student of... Recognize him? There he is. The usual suspects. Gee whiz. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about all this? Well, I certainly am not worried about any virus or any disease now that I know how to be healthy and to heal any disease. The worrisome part is the psychopaths that are lying to scare people into submission and accepting their offer of drugs and, you know, limited freedom. That's the scary part. But I follow some other people that might be able to help. There's, let's see. Go here. This I gotta watch. Anthropology of Occult Secret Societies. That's next up. And where is my man? I can't remember his name right now. There he is. How master manipulators use propaganda to indoctrinate useful idiots. John Leckrone. How master manipulators use propaganda to indoctrinate useful idiots. Well, we just saw a whole video about how they did it with AIDS. And we cannot have progress during times of confusion, chaos, and trauma-based mind control. Episode 66. Yeah. I hope he offers some type of answer. I know he says don't consent, so I don't have a problem with. I mean, I know all about not consenting, but what can we actually do? So I'll watch that. I'll report back tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have a plan of action for fighting against these master manipulators. Now I'm going to watch The Anthropology of Occult Secret Societies by Robert Sepper. I'll be back.